In the mid-19th century, governments across the United States and Europe began constructing schools. The official record is straightforward. Rising populations, expanding cities, progressive reformers pushing for universal education. The story has been told many times in many textbooks. But here is one number worth sitting with. Between 1850 and 1870, the city of Cincinnati built enough school seats to educate approximately 28,000 children. The city's enrolled school-age population at the time, just under 11,000. That gap, nearly 17,000 empty seats, was not an accident of poor planning. It was a pattern. And once you start looking for it, it appears in city after city, country after country, decade after decade. Before we go further, one thing needs to be said clearly. This documentary does not argue that history was falsified, that governments are hiding a secret civilization, or that anything was deliberately erased. What it does is look at a series of architectural and administrative facts, verifiable, documented, sourced, and ask what those facts, taken together, actually suggest. The conclusions belong to you. First American public school systems were built in the 1830s and 1840s, largely through the work of reformers like Horace Mann, who believed universal education was the foundation of a functioning republic. The argument was moral, civic, and urgent. Legislatures responded. Funding was allocated. Construction began. And the buildings that went up were, by almost any measure, extraordinary. In Buffalo, New York, School No. 38, constructed in 1871, was a three-story Italianate structure with 14-foot ceilings, arched windows, ornamental cornices, and a central hall wide enough to function as a public assembly space. It was built to serve a neighborhood of roughly 900 families. It had capacity for over 1,200 students. The neighborhood would not reach that population density for another 30 years. In Cleveland, the Brownell Street School, completed in 1868, had similar proportions. Designed by the city architect, it featured load-bearing masonry walls, 2 feet thick, hardwood staircases, and ventilation shafts built directly into the structure, a feature that engineers in the 1860s described as technically demanding and expensive. The ventilation system alone cost more than the average residential construction budget for the entire block surrounding it. These were not modest community buildings, they were civic monuments. And the question that slowly surfaces when you look at them together is not whether they were well built. It's why they were built this way, at this scale, at this particular moment. The population argument that planners were simply anticipating growth holds for some cases. Cities were expanding. Immigration was accelerating. Prudent administrators might reasonably build ahead of demand. But the margin is strange. In 1860, St. Louis had a documented school-age population of roughly 18,000 children. The city's combined school capacity, including buildings already under construction, exceeded 40,000. That is not planning ahead. That is building a system scaled for a city roughly 2.5 times larger than the one that existed. Philadelphia's numbers are similar. So are Baltimore's. And when you extend the comparison across the Atlantic to Manchester, to Leeds, to Lyon, to Hamburg, the same ratio appears with unsettling consistency. Not identical numbers, but the same structural relationship. Capacity that significantly outpaces documented enrollment, built with materials and craftsmanship that exceed what basic utility required. In Manchester, England, board schools constructed between 1870 and 1880 under the Education Act were built with a specificity that still impresses structural historians. The Ancoats district, one of the most densely overcrowded working-class neighborhoods in Victorian Britain, received 3 new schools in a 7-year window. Each was built in Gothic Revival style, with decorative brickwork, stone keystones above every window, and internal timber framing sourced from Baltic suppliers, the same quality of wood used in church construction. Children who attended those schools came from families living 6 and 8 to a room in back-to-back terraces. Their parents worked 14-hour shifts in the mills 50 yards away. The gap between the buildings and the lives they were built for is not invisible. It is one of the more quietly striking contrasts in 19th century urban history. In Lyon, the municipal schools built during the Third Republic's early expansion phase in the 1870s were constructed on a standardized plan developed by the city's architectural office. Historians have noted that the plan itself, the dimensions, the ceiling heights, the placement of windows, The width of corridors matches almost exactly the specifications used in public school construction in both Philadelphia and Toronto during the same decade. Not approximately. Almost exactly. The Lion plans were developed internally by French municipal architects working within the French administrative system. The Philadelphia plans came from a separate office in a separate country, with no documented communication between the two institutions. Toronto's came from yet another source. 3 cities, 3 separate administrative systems, 3 nearly identical buildings. Whether that reflects a shared inheritance of classical architectural principles, common circulation of pattern books, or something else entirely, that is the kind of question this film keeps returning to. There is a phrase that surfaces occasionally in the margins of 19th century municipal records, in budget reports, in correspondence between city engineers, in the minutes of school board meetings from cities as different as Cincinnati and Edinburgh. The phrase is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply says, in various forms, built to accommodate future need. Future need. Not current need. Not projected need based on census data or immigration forecasts, just future need. As if the builders understood with a confidence that the available numbers did not entirely justify that the children would come. And in almost every case, eventually they did. But the buildings were ready before anyone knew that. They were ready before the demographic data existed to support the decision. They were ready in a way that implies either extraordinary foresight, extraordinary waste, or a third possibility that takes longer to articulate. The architecture was not built for the city that existed. It was built for a city that was, in some sense, expected, planned for, assumed. What that assumption was based on is where this story gets more complicated. The Erie Canal opened in 1825, connected the Hudson River to the Great Lakes, running 363 miles across upstate New York through terrain that engineers of the era described as genuinely formidable. The project took 8 years to complete, employed thousands of workers, and cost the state of New York approximately $7 million, a sum that represented at the time a significant portion of the entire state's annual budget. It was, by any measure, an audacious infrastructure investment. What is less frequently discussed is the scale of the storage infrastructure built alongside it. Grain warehouses, called elevators, were constructed at intervals along the canal route at Albany, at Utica, at Syracuse, at Rochester, at Buffalo. These were not temporary holding structures. They were permanent, engineered facilities with load-bearing floors, ventilation systems, and receiving capacities that, in several cases, exceeded the total grain output of the surrounding agricultural region at the time of construction. Buffalo Grain Elevator Complex, begun in the 1840s, could store more grain than all the farms within a 100-mile radius could collectively produce in a single season. By the 1860s, it was operating near capacity, but for the first decade of its existence, significant portions of it stood empty, waiting, built before the demand, ready before the supply. This pattern infrastructure preceding population, capacity preceding use appears with enough regularity across 19th century America and Britain that economic historians have a term for it. They call it supply-side infrastructure investment. A theory that building systems ahead of demand actively generates the demand that fills them. The argument is compelling, and it explains a great deal. But it does not fully explain the schools. Supply-side logic works cleanly for canals and railways, where the infrastructure itself enables new economic activity, trade routes, settlement patterns, industrial growth. Build the canal, and farmers can now ship grain to market, so more grain gets farmed. The infrastructure creates its own justification. Schools do not operate that way. A school does not generate children the way a canal generates freight. The children have to already exist, or be anticipated with reasonable specificity. Before a school board allocates funds, commissions an architect, and breaks ground on a building that will stand for a century. And yet the schools were built at scale, ahead of documented need, with a consistency that crosses national borders and administrative systems. The railway station at Huddersfield, England, completed in 1850, is one of the finest examples of neoclassical civic architecture in the north of England. Its portico has 6 Corinthian columns. Its facade is 416 feet wide. At the time of its completion, Huddersfield had a population of approximately 30,000 people. The station was built to handle passenger volumes that the town would not generate for another 40 years. When the railway historian Jack Simmons examined Victorian station construction across Britain in the 1970s, he noted something that had not received much attention. The sizing of stations bore almost no consistent relationship to the populations of the towns they served at the time of construction. Stations in market towns were built to the same proportional specifications as stations in major cities. The designs came from the same pattern catalogues. The materials were sourced from the same suppliers. What differed was decoration. What remained constant was capacity. In the United States, the federal land grant system of the 1860s offers another angle on this. The Morrill Act of 1862 granted federal land to states specifically to fund colleges focused on agriculture and the mechanical arts. 69 institutions were eventually established under the act. Many of them were built on sites that were, at the time of construction, genuinely remote, surrounded by farmland, accessible only by dirt roads, serving student populations that numbered in the dozens during their first years of operation. The buildings constructed on those campuses were not modest. Michigan Agricultural College, later Michigan State University, built its first permanent structures in brick and stone with assembly halls, laboratories, and dormitories that could accommodate student bodies many times larger than the ones that initially enrolled. The campus plan, drawn up in the early 1860s, laid out a grid of future buildings that would not be completed for generations. Someone drew that grid. Someone decided the institution would eventually need all of it. Whether that confidence came from demographic projections, institutional ambition, or something harder to name, the result was the same. The space was prepared before the people arrived to fill it. The administrative similarities across national borders are harder to dismiss than the architectural ones. In 1870, Britain passed the Elementary Education Act, creating a national system of school boards empowered to build and maintain schools funded through local rates. 3 years later, Ontario passed the Free Schools Act, creating a nearly identical administrative structure. In 1874, several German states consolidated their existing school board systems into a unified administrative framework that shared, in its core provisions, a striking number of features with both the British and Canadian models. These were not secret collaborations. Educational reformers did correspond. Ideas did travel. The international reform network of the 19th century was real and documented, but the architectural output of these separately administered systems converged in ways that go slightly beyond shared ideology. Buildings in Birmingham look like the buildings in Toronto, look like the buildings in Frankfurt, not in their stylistic ornamentation, which varies by national tradition, but in their structural proportions, their classroom dimensions, their corridor widths, and their ventilation specifications. Someone somewhere settled on a template, and that template was applied with remarkable consistency across jurisdictions that had no formal obligation to share it. There is a term that began appearing in alternative history communities sometime in the early 2000s, a term borrowed from old cartographic tradition, purpose to describe something the people using it were struggling to name. The term was Tartaria. In its original usage, Tartaria referred to a vast, loosely defined region of Central Asia that appeared on European maps from the medieval period through the 18th century. It was a geographic designation, not a political one, a cartographer's shorthand for territory that was vast, only partially mapped, and inhabited by peoples that European administrations did not fully understand. By the time modern nation-states redrew the world's borders in the 19th century, Tartaria had disappeared from official maps. The territory it described had been absorbed into the Russian Empire, the Ottoman sphere, the Qing dynasty. The name itself became a historical footnote. What it became in the 21st century is something different and considerably more difficult to assess without first understanding what these buildings actually represent. Because the architecture that prompted the question is real. The capacity gaps are documented. The cross-border consistency is measurable. The label that gets attached to the observation is where the story becomes genuinely complicated. And that is where this has been heading all along. The word Tartaria appears on a map printed in Amsterdam in 1688. The cartographer was Nicholas Sanson, and the territory he labeled stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific coast, an enormous, loosely bounded region that European geographers understood to be real, inhabited, and significant, but could not precisely define. It was not a nation in the modern sense. It had no single capital, no unified government, no formal diplomatic representation in European courts. It was a geographic reality that resisted the categories European administrators preferred. For roughly 3 centuries, it appeared on maps. Then, gradually, it did not. The territory was absorbed. The name was retired. What had been labeled Tartaria became, on 19th century maps, a series of more precisely bounded designations: Siberia, Turkestan, Mongolia, the Russian Far East. The older term was not erased dramatically. It simply became obsolete, the way many geographic terms do when the political world reorganizes itself around new borders. That is the historical origin. It is documented, uncontroversial, and not particularly mysterious. What happened to the word in the 21st century is a different matter. Beginning roughly in the early 2010s and accelerating significantly through online communities around 2018 and 2019, Tartaria was repurposed. Forum users, YouTube channels, and independent researchers began using it to describe a hypothetical lost civilization, one they believed had existed globally, had been highly developed, and had left behind architectural evidence that standard historical narratives did not adequately explain. The buildings that prompted this theory were, in large part, the buildings we have been examining in this film: the 19th century schools, the oversized railway stations, the grain infrastructure built before the grain, the civic monuments constructed for populations that had not yet arrived. People advancing the Tartaria theory looked at these structures and asked, what if the official explanation, reform movements, supply-side investment, civic ambition, is incomplete? What if the buildings were not constructed for anticipated populations, but inherited from one that had already existed, and then, for reasons the historical record does not clearly document, was no longer there? It is an extraordinary claim, and it deserves to be examined with the same rigor as any other explanation. There are, broadly speaking, 3 frameworks through which the architectural evidence examined in this film can be interpreted. The first is the conventional historical model. In this framework, the buildings were built by the people the records say built them, for the reasons the records describe. The capacity gaps reflect a combination of supply-side logic, civic ambition, and the genuine belief among 19th century reformers that population growth would eventually justify the investment. The cross-border consistency reflects the real and documented circulation of ideas among international reform networks, shared pattern books, and the global influence of neoclassical architectural training. The buildings are impressive because the people who built them wanted them to be impressive, because civic architecture was understood in that era as a statement of collective aspiration. This model is supported by extensive documentation. It explains most of the evidence cleanly. The second framework is the inheritance model, which is what the Tartaria theory, in its more careful formulations, actually proposes. In this framework, at least some of the buildings were not constructed in the 19th century, but were inherited, repurposed, reclassified, incorporated into the newly expanding administrative systems of the modern nation-state. The argument is not that history was fabricated wholesale, but that the historical record has gaps, periods, particularly around the early 19th century, where documentation is thinner than one might expect, and where the official narrative of construction sometimes rests on fewer primary sources than the buildings themselves might seem to require. The year 1816 is significant in this model. Known historically as the year without a summer caused by the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815, it produced catastrophic crop failures across the northern hemisphere, population displacement on a massive scale, and a degree of institutional disruption that historians acknowledge was severe. Some proponents of the inheritance model point to this period as a possible inflection point, a moment of sufficient disruption that it could, theoretically, have obscured or reorganized the historical record in ways that are now difficult to reconstruct. This model is speculative. Its evidentiary basis is partial, but it is not, on its face, incoherent. The third framework might be called the convergence model. It does not require either conventional explanation or lost civilization. It simply observes that certain architectural and administrative patterns appear consistently across cultures and centuries, that the proportions considered appropriate for civic buildings, the dimensions considered functional for educational spaces, the structural specifications considered durable for public infrastructure, tend to converge across independent traditions because they reflect underlying practical and aesthetic constraints that are relatively universal. In this model, the similarity between a school in Birmingham and a school in Toronto and a school in Lyon is not evidence of shared origin or shared inheritance. It is evidence that human beings, building for similar purposes under similar material constraints, tend to arrive at similar solutions. The convergence model is intellectually elegant. It explains the cross-border consistency without requiring either a conspiracy or a lost empire. The Year Without a Summer left a mark on 19th century consciousness that persisted for decades. Mary Shelley began writing Frankenstein during that summer 1816, in a house near Lake Geneva, during weeks of cold and rain that kept the guests indoors. The novel she produced was, among other things, a meditation on creation without accountability, the thing built, and the question of what happens when the builder is no longer present to explain it. It is a useful metaphor for what this film has been circling. The buildings exist. Their scale is real. Their consistency across borders is measurable. The gap between their capacity and the populations they initially served is documented. What those facts mean depends entirely on the framework you bring to them. And every framework, the conventional one, the inheritance one, the convergence one, contains something the others leave unexplained. There is a version of this story in which 19th century civic ambition was simply larger than we now remember, in which the people who built these schools and stations and warehouses understood themselves to be constructing the physical foundation of a world that did not yet exist, and built accordingly, with a confidence that the historical record sometimes struggles to fully account for. There is another version in which the confidence came from somewhere else entirely, from knowledge of what had been, rather than vision of what would be. And there is a third version in which the distinction between those two things is less clear than it appears. The buildings are still standing. In many cases, they are still in use. Children still sit in rooms with 14-foot ceilings and arched windows, in structures built for a population that, depending on how you read the evidence, either had not arrived yet or had already been there and left. The evidence invites examination. What it does not do, despite how often it is asked to, is resolve.